Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for sticking around for this next conversation. I'm Dan Murphy from CNBC, and thanks also to FII for putting together the New Africa Summit, a really critical conversation taking place over the next few days. So thank you again for being here and also for joining us online. As you've heard, we're going to talk about one of the most critical issues facing the continent and these countries, and it is the fight against food insecurity. So over the next 30 minutes, we're going to talk about some of the factors that are driving food insecurity globally and across the African continent. So let's dive straight into the conversation. Yasser, I'd like to start with you. And first of all, Nestlé is, of course, the world's largest listed food group. So outline the scope of this problem for me and what the company is doing to actively address it.
Thank you, Dan. Good afternoon, everybody. To start with, we believe the food and beverage industry has a key role in playing in ensuring food security across the world. Nestlé, being a leading food and beverage company present in 188 countries with more than 340 factories, has in our DNA the belief that creating shared value is essential for sustainable business and overall development. So what we have done is we work very closely with farmers across the world, in Africa and beyond. We understand the fork to plate or to the table, and we ensure that we do this in a sustainable manner across the world. Today, as we know, crop shortage is unfortunately on the rise. Weather conditions, global supply shortages, biofuel increase. So we are in a challenge where, as a group, we are also investing in R&D in Africa and beyond, also to create solutions across the board. Just to also put things in context, then, for example, when we look at Africa, we're talking about roughly 30 million kilometers square land, 1.4 billion people, more than 400 people, unfortunately, living below economic standard. So there's a big responsibility on all of us, not to only ensure a sustainable model, but to ensure availability and accessibility of nutritious products to everybody across the world and in Africa.
Indeed, and really well explained in terms of just setting the context for us, because all of this is absolutely interlinked, of course, directly correlated with economic growth and individual economic outcomes as well. Let's move the conversation over to Sanjiv, because I wanted to ask about the ITC angle on this, and in particular, what we can learn from the Indian context as well. So help us understand this. What can be done to improve yields, food distribution, and to broadly transform agriculture in Africa?
Thank you, Dan. And let me start off by saying that, this is a very important facet, because not only is it important from the perspective of transformation of Africa, because 60% of the people are employed in that sector, but I think it's also critical from global food and nutrition security perspective, because Africa has more than half the world's land, and yields today are a fourth of its potential. And from a context perspective, I think there are some lessons certainly from India that can be applied there, because challenges are similar, both from what private sector can do and what policy can enable. And if you look at it, 33 million small and marginal farmers in Africa. India has same kind of issues, a lot of issues with natural resources, degraded soil, archaic agronomic practices, lack of the modern science and technology being applied. So this is really the problems. What can we do about it? Now, I think ultimately, the vision has to be, I'll start with the vision and then talk about the building steps. We will have to create value chain clusters which have the ecosystem to enable productive and competitive value chains that are sustainable. And the building block of that, I think, has to be farmer cooperatives. In India, we call it FPO, enabled by policy in India, because you need to bring some aggregation to be able to make some impact on the ground. The second piece is that besides capacity building to FPO, I think the second piece is that we'll have to find local and customized solutions to the challenges there. Because the financial resources are also limited, we have to find smart solutions. India has done well on bio-based fertilizers. India has done well on natural farming. India has done well on open pollinated seeds. So we can even create some farmer producer organizations that will deal with the inputs that become, low cost. The third very important piece is the role of digitization. Now, investments in public digital infrastructure at a general level, investment in an agri-stack, and then the application layer by value chain players like, in India, ITC has got ITC Mars, where we have several billion farmers aligned to it. So that's not only for crop advisory, also access to financial credit, also access to inputs, also market connectivity. So a series of things have to be done. But to make all this happen, I think it's also important that the physical infrastructure is sorted out, because crops have to move, access has to be there, and some physical infrastructure of storage has to be created, otherwise perishability is there. And I think one very important thing, I think in 2018, Africa laid the foundation for it, was the free trade agreement across Africa. So whatever it takes with respect to ease of doing business there, because agriculture crops must move seamlessly, otherwise cost of storage, wastage can be huge and can make it absolutely unproductive. So a lot of things there to be done, and really I would say this is a complex area, has to be done from a spirit of public-private partnership.
And I think that's really important too. We'll touch a little bit more on the opportunity for the private sector as well, how that's being de-risked and how to build those public-private partnerships as well. But Abdul, I wanted to bring the conversation over to you. We've heard a little bit about the challenge. Talk to me about the opportunity and what is the group doing to be part of the solution?
Thank you very much. Well, the opportunities in Africa are immense, as we all know. Africa is a continent of 1.4, 1.5 billion people, and we all know that more than 60% of the remaining uncultivated land, arable land in the whole world is in Africa. So those are some of the opportunities. We have 1.4 billion people. We have immense resources as far as water is concerned. We have the climate and we have the land. So the opportunities are there. But the issues are, in most cases, how to harness those opportunities, in terms of, having to ensure that we have food security. Because as we have always maintained, and we know that Africa is a net importer of food. And that is a paradox that is not sustainable in Africa. We have all these opportunities. But of course, again, the challenges are there, as we all know. Poor infrastructure. We need, to have roads, as, my friend just said. We must have storage so that if we're able to farm, we must be able to sustain and have, those in place. So unless we do that, I think we'll continue to have, serious issues. We need to really be able to feed ourselves. I'm talking about me as an African now, because without that, it would be a problem. And the opportunities, as I said, are there. And then, of course, we have this huge opportunity, as also mentioned, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which I think needs to also be harnessed. But again, if you look at it in terms of food security, 282 million people are actually hungry in terms of, if you look at the population, of those. And, across 59 countries, half of those people are in Africa and they are hungry. So we really need to address, that issue. The issue of food security is very, very key. We must continue to address the issue.
Joe, one of the things you've spoken about in the past is this nutrition deficit and why access to protein is so critical. Tell us a little bit about your business and what you're doing to address that challenge and scale aquaculture in Africa to ensure that you have that access to protein that's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so it's been covered by many of the great speakers today, but the deficit in protein and the deficit in nutrition facing Africans today is at historic levels, and in many areas getting worse. And we could do statistics all day, but even just that there's 50+ million children who are in some version of acute malnutrition, effectively locking the poverty cycle for the next generation, is an unacceptable outcome. And so as food practitioners and food systems, working with governments, we need to find a solution to that. Many countries in Africa were predominantly fish-eating cultures, but with the collapse of wild catch fisheries across many parts of the world, including Africa, sometimes 95% collapse in wild stocks. In Lake Victoria, we've had half of the endemic species go extinct in the last 50 years. It has resulted in a protein deficit that's acute, and it's made protein very expensive and unaffordable. So the solution that Victory Farms has innovated and pioneered is investing across the entire protein ecosystem, the whole value chain. So all the way from formulation science and plant nutrition, into feed, into fish, and then cold chain and retail to millions of consumers every month throughout East Africa. It's really about building an imaginative view toward what's possible if we go and invest across the whole ecosystem. And as a result, we've made fish affordable and available for many, many millions of families in East Africa.
Brilliant. So that's real work being done on the ground that's delivering an end goal. So I think that's really, really important. We'll touch on that again. But one of the other things you also spoke about, I think we'll get Yasser to respond to, which was the collapse that we've seen in some food systems. How is a company like Nestlé protecting against some of those supply chain shocks and the collapse that we see? And what can you do to build resilience?
We have to say that it's been, to say the least, quite eventful. COVID came. Then we had Russia-Ukraine war, geopolitical instability in the region, unfortunately, the Red Sea crisis. So even transport has been quite a challenge. What we do as a company is we have the moral obligation to ensure availability of our products, sometimes at any cost, because we are in essential items. Think baby food, think water. So there are critical categories we operate in. For example, what we do is we moved into air shipments in some cases, in some others, many more modular transport instead of one approach. As you know, we had many ships had to go through the Cape of Good Hope, so it took longer as the process. So many things had to change. But what also, as a global food company and the leading food and beverage company, the advantage is also the fact that we have global and local presence, so we can, if you want, recalibrate what is needed there and what is needed locally. But what is also critically important with what we're witnessing, if you remember, we used to call this the new normal post-COVID. I hope this is not the new normal, but it does seem that we are in a kind of a new normal. And I think that's where it comes that in order to ensure food security, there is nothing stronger than being local and closer to the consumer. And I'm happy on that front that we announced in 2022 a $7 billion investment in Saudi Arabia. And I had the privilege to meet Minister of Investment yesterday and His Excellency Minister of Industry today to update on the progress, a factory that will produce baby food starting end of 2025, early 26 in MENA, for example. So this will bring the total number of factories to 25, only in MENA, 22 factories in Africa. And I think that's part and parcel of also ensuring the food security across the region.
Indeed, and large companies like Nestlé have a really active role to play in addressing this challenge 100%. As well. Also wanted to ask you, Sanjay, just on this, with regards to some of the supply chain issues that we've been hearing about, I guess it's not just issues in the supply chain, it's rising costs as well. Yasser spoke about COVID. Of course, the inflationary impact that we saw off the back of that was really profound, particularly in the consumer goods segment, and of course Africa wasn't immune. How do we address food security and affordability at the same time?
It's a very good question, Dan. Really, it's a whole issue of imbalance between demand and supply. And actually, unfortunately, in either of the cases, the farmer is the loser. Now, really, there are two underlying structural issues as far as this is concerned. One, I think, is generally the agriculture system is one of the most inefficient systems, because the approach is very transactional. Wherever somebody gets it a little cheaper, you're wanting to source from there. So there's no long-term commitment to it. I mean, would you do that for an automobile spare part? You would not do that. So we have to treat agriculture with a lot of respect and long-term commitment. We need to create dedicated food and nutritional corridors and get the farming community to invest behind it with some commitments. Otherwise, it will be all ups and downs, and sometimes more will be produced, sometimes less will be produced. Either case doesn't work for the farmers, doesn't work for consumers. It's a lose-lose situation. The second structural issue, I think, is the whole issue of climate emergency, which is the bigger issue today. And crops are failing by higher frequency and higher quantums year after year. That's what's causing the shocks. So we really need to build resilience in the agriculture value chain, and it is possible to do so. We have in India and ITC, we have a very large climate smart agriculture program. It covers about nearly 1 million hectares right now, and we started this several years back. 70% of the zones have moved into high yield and high resilience, where GHG emissions have reduced up to 60% and farmer incomes have improved up to 90%. So what is good for planet is also good for society and the farmers. So we need to bring in these practices, and how you bring it in is the method I spoke about earlier. That's the method to do it. But it's also important to look at some nuances here, because the climate issues can be heat, drought, floods, so it could be different types, and the same solution will not work for each situation. So I think what is important is we need to use AI to do climate risk modeling. Like across several value chains in India, in ITC, we've kind of done decadal forecasting to identify hotspots. So if I look at, for example, a wheat value chain, the challenge in the west of India and the challenge anticipated in the east of India is very different. So you need to create different solution kits for each area. So, but the climate risk modeling is important so that you are sharp targeting your interventions. Without that, effort will be dispersed. And the last thing that's also important here is that some of these solutions require a lot of sophisticated research, some of sophisticated technologies of agriculture. So you need to integrate R&D institutions and innovation centers with problem zones, and you need to create an ecosystem of micro enterprises, because in places like India or Africa, each farmer cannot afford a drone or a remote sensing device. So it has to be a micro enterprises. Through the digital application will supply these as a service for a fee. So that kind of ecosystem is also very important to make all of this work.
Fascinating. And Abdul, can you react to that as well? We spoke a little bit about the climate impact of increased agricultural output. Does that really matter when you're trying to solve a problem this big?
Well, it depends. It does matter, but then again, when people are starving at the end of the day, I think, that takes more of a center stage, than climate. And as we have, said earlier, I mean, the important thing is to address this food insecurity. Just like when the issue of, coal, you remember the issue of coal, a few years ago, and everybody was talking about, today, we are back to green energy and using of coal. So it's a matter of necessity. I think what is important is for us to address this issue of food insecurity in Africa. Our group, Boa Foods, we are milling over 1.5 million tons of wheat per annum and processing over 1.2 million tons of sugar. We have 2 sugar refineries, we have a plantation in Nigeria, so we are doing our own bit. But the challenge is that we need to be able to farm, to be able to produce this, locally. We should be able, with all these resources that we have in Africa, be able to feed ourselves. With 65% of the world's arable land, with over 300 days of, good climate, sunshine, and with water, there's no reason why Africans should go hungry. So I think that is more important than, well, I wouldn't say it's more important than the climate, but I think, it's important for us to be able to feed ourselves, because as we all know, a hungry man is an angry man.
Indeed. And Joe, over to you, because I thought Sanjay mentioned something interesting as well with regards to the technology piece here, maybe even the impact of AI. What role can technology play in addressing this challenge, and what are you doing to incorporate some of the technological solutions into your own processes?
Yeah, absolutely. And Sanjay made a great point around some of the inefficiencies across the value chain. In tilapia aquaculture, it's a 4,000-year-old industry. It goes back to the ancient Egyptians. And the role of technology that we're deploying today is completely revolutionizing this industry to make it much more efficient. Versus a traditional pond farming system, which is the prevalent, there's millions of these across Africa and Asia. We are, through the application of technology today, 1,000 times more land efficient, and by direct cause water efficient, than the traditional practices. And so these types of scale changes make it possible for us to scale our business. And this year we're enjoying another year of 100% growth with quite a large organization. But technology enables us to scale it. I'll share one anecdote with the community, because I think that came up earlier too, is we've also transitioned our business model to source all of our input eggs from partner farms around. So we've trained and dug many partner farms. And so through the use of drones, we're probably one of the first fish businesses in the world to transport eggs from smallholder partners several kilometers through the air with modern drones, and then it goes into our incubation system. But it allows us to circumvent power issues, road issues, and tie together our community in a way that the physical infrastructure would not allow. So I think technology is currently playing, and it's going to play a huge role in addressing some of these issues.
Indeed. And we are rapidly running out of time, but I hope this has been a very valuable panel for each of you in understanding the scope of this problem, some of the solutions, and also some of the opportunities out there. But we'll have to leave it there. Please thank my panel again for joining us here at the summit, ladies and gentlemen.